Hello, and welcome to another episode of Trust and Trade, a podcast produced by the Antitrust Law Section of the American Bar Association. Trust and Trade is a podcast for seasoned practitioners interested in deep dives into the areas of competition, consumer protection, and privacy law, and casual listeners who want to better understand some of the hot-button issues in these fields. Each episode is presented by one of the specialty committees within the section. This episode is produced and co-hosted by the Agriculture and Food Committee of the Antitrust Law Section. Today's episode asks, why is your grocery bill so high? If you feel like you're paying more for groceries than you used to, you're not imagining it. Grocery prices today are about 25% higher than they were in 2020. I'm here today with my co-hosts, Evan Harris and Erika Inwald. I want everyone listening to pick out your most recent grocery bill. You can pause this while you go get it. We'll be here. Okay, Erika, Evan, do you have your grocery bills?
Got it.
Yep.
Okay. Where do you guys shop, by the way?
Trader Joe's for me. It's very close to my apartment.
Depends where I'm up for going.
So over a 4-year period, the price of eggs has gone up 54%. The price of milk, 36%. Cheese and butter, plus 30%. Bread, crackers, cookies, plus 28%. Chicken, up 25%. Beef, plus 20%. And fresh fruits and vegetables, up 21%. We started seeing food price inflation accelerating in early 2021. That's when we started absorbing the supply chain shocks from the pandemic, jumping from just 1.4% in January 2021 to 3.5% by March. And it kept climbing month after month, peaking at 11.4% in August of 2022. Now compare that to the 20-year average rate of food inflation of 2.7%. Now, while the overall food inflation rate has started gradually pulling back after that August 2022 peak, meaning that the rate at which food prices go up has begun to decelerate, prices have remained high for most grocery categories compared to pre-pandemic levels. Now, for context, over the same period of time, wages in a lot of sectors have grown at a higher rate than grocery prices. And the amount spent on food as a percentage of total household expenditures has gone down dramatically over the past 100 years. Yet it's hard to counter with positive economic signs when the only two indicators most Americans keep track of are the price of gas and the price of groceries, both of which have been going up. And even in this election cycle, as the two political parties try to motivate voters with the big picture themes about the Supreme Court, woke ideology, immigration, foreign policy, one of the top two issues on most voters' minds is that $100 worth of groceries 4 years ago cost $125 today. What exactly is causing this, and whether antitrust can do anything about it, is the subject of today's episode. So as I said, joining me today are my co-hosts Evan Harris, an associate at Morrison Foerster, and Erika Inwald, an associate at Hausfeld. Welcome, Evan and Erika.
Hi, Anant. Very excited to be here.
Yes, thanks for having us.
Who do we have on the show today?
We have some really great speakers here with us today. One of our speakers is Austin Frerick. Austin is a fellow of the Thurman Arnold Project at Yale University, an initiative that brings together faculty, students, and scholars to collaborate on research related to competition policy and antitrust enforcement. He recently published his debut book, very exciting, Barron's, Money, Power, and the Corruption of America's Food Industry, which profiles a series of powerful magnets to illustrate the concentration of power in the American food system.
Our other speaker today is Tim Richards. Tim is the Morrison Chair of Agribusiness at the W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University. He earned his PhD in agricultural economics from Stanford University. His research focuses on areas of applied econometrics with respect to food markets and food policy issues, and he has written many papers about competition in the food industry and particularly among supermarkets. Tim, Austin, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Recently, the DOJ and the FTC under the Biden administration have been very public about their attention to the food supply chain. For instance, in March 2022, the agencies co-hosted a listening session on the effects of the M&A activity in the food and agriculture segment. At that session, FTC Chair Khan described how consolidation has left food producers with fewer ways to get their products to market, while consumers see higher prices. So let's start with the fundamental question of what's causing the rise in grocery bills. Is it consolidation, M&A activity, inflation, or something else?
Well, hey, this is Austin. I mean, I start with the premise. So even before this inflation cycle hit, Americans are already spending more on food than other Western democracies. Dollar for dollar, I think we're over about $3,000 per person. That's higher than like the UK, Germany, Canada, and we're about dollar for dollar even with Italy. And I think anyone that's been to Italy knows dollar for dollar, you're getting a much higher quality thing there, which shouldn't be shocked. I mean, it's almost become the norm now, especially in the meat and dairy cases, to see price fixing allegation lawsuits. I mean, concentrated markets gouge is what they do. And I should also say, it's pretty cliche now for Americans to go abroad and say, I ate better food, paid less, and lost weight. So even before this cycle began, we were dealing with a concentrated food industry that was gouging consumers. I think what's even more what we've seen really play out these last few years is even when we talk about these markets, we talk about them in a national context, but food is such a regional thing. Like take dairy. Pete Hardin did a paper at Yale Law School 2 years ago where one company has an 85% market share in fluid milk in New England and the tri-state area. And I don't think anyone needs a PhD in econ to know that people in those milk markets are not paying a competitive price for milk. There's likely gouging going on.
Hey, this is Tim. I'm an economist, agricultural economist, so I like to think about things from a fundamental level, from commodity markets and things. Recently, of course, there's been interest across all agencies in the causes and implications of food price inflation. Office of Chief Economist of the USDA published a study in one of our flagship journals, our policy journal. I'm a member of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association of the USDA. So our flagship policy journal is Applied Economics Policy and Perspectives. The study, sliced and diced using all the latest data, and latest econometric methods, getting to the causes of food price inflation. And they found that most of it was supply chain and origin. Higher wages, higher commodity prices due to Russian invasion of Ukraine, things like that. Transportation snarls, labor shortages, you name it. Very little of it was due to demand pull from the stimulus, and none of it due to concentration. So we have to make fact-based solutions here. We look at antitrust and we start regulating companies. It has to be based on the data. It can't be based on conjecture.
So then, is it at all have anything to do with consolidation? The fact that our prices are so high at the grocery store? People, I heard Austin say that there's a lot of price gouging. Is that related to consolidation? Where's the consolidation taking place?
We don't see any evidence of price gouging at all in the econometrics. There's anecdotal evidence, yes, and we have laws against that. A lot of them kicked in early during COVID. But again, we have to differentiate between price levels and food price inflation. I'm no doubt that retailers and food processors, the whole supply chain, are relatively tight oligopolies. So price levels are going to be higher. But inflation is the rate of change of price levels. And there's no theoretical connection between concentration at all and inflation. Actually, it's inverse. So we have to make that important distinction between the two.
I'd be careful. I tend to rely more on journalist stories here. I think there was a really good paper I would like to flag for people by Kate Conlow. She's a former journalist turned lawyer. She wrote a paper at Yale Law School's grocery conference 2 years ago where there's a disclosure issue with a lot of these journals, especially in the agriculture space. A lot of academics are taking industry money and not disclosing it, even though these journals have disclosure policies. And so, like, for example, I note this in my book. There's Dermot Hayes of Iowa State. He's like the go-to hog industry person. He's the one that always says, oh, you could speed up the kill lines. It's good for industry. He doesn't disclose usually in journals that he's an expert witness for most of these meat companies and that he also does personal business transactions with like my hog baron. So I would be careful there on the theoretical sense where I think in a reality sense, when a company has an 85% market share, they're going to gouge.
Yeah, again, that's conjecture. And I used to be editor of our flagship journal. And I really take exception at you calling out colleagues of mine for unethical academic practices.
I'm not calling them out.
That's wrong.
Katie looked at their disclosures. No,
we have disclosure
she
policies
did her own
for all of our
investigative
journals
work.
Now. You have to disclose.
They're not enforced, is what she
Everything
knows.
is replicable. If you want to, you can go get their data and you can replicate the results.
And so one thing I heard, at least from both of you, is that there is, I heard you, Tim, say that there are oligopolies in these different supply chains. And, Austin, you were saying that there is this level of concentration in some of these food supply chains. So if that's what we're seeing, do we find that some of this consolidation in one part of the food supply chain is affecting the other? Help explain maybe how the food supply chain consolidations are affecting each other, or maybe they're not. I don't know.
Yeah, I loved. There's this guy named Errol. He runs a publication called The Checkoff. He used to be a former vice president at Whole Foods. He once told me this great phrase: "Big boys like to run with big boys." The creation of one robber baron tends to create others. One monopoly creates others because you want market power for negotiations. So, like the creation of Walmart, I really think is fascinating and interesting to study here. Where their market, we've never seen this kind of market power in the food system in the history of mankind. They sell 1 in 3 groceries. The market share is the same as the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th combined. And it's supply and command. Like you can't negotiate with a company that big. So what tends to happen is companies engage in aggressive transactions to get some kind of leverage when you can negotiate against such a powerful entity. Keep in mind, this is the largest private employer in America. It's the richest family in America, sometimes in the world. And so you see that massive consolidation, especially as a lot of, whatever current antitrust framework you want to use to describe this moment really collapsed since the 1980s. You can see, for example, JAB is my coffee baron in my book. They didn't sell a single coffee bean in America until 2012 when they bought Peet's. Went through aggressive acquisition spree, and now they sell more coffee than Starbucks. You would never know it because they own a bunch of brands like Panera, Krispy Kreme, Pret a Manger, but that's all about market power.
There's the essence of that argument I would agree with, that big has to begets big. There's no empirical evidence that shows that one causes the other, but it just makes logical sense. Most of the deals now, for efficiency purposes, are done on negotiation basis between highly sophisticated, technologically adept large companies. That just happened to leave small companies behind because there tends to be economies of scale and things like that. To invest in technology, to invest in the type of scale that it takes to deal with other big companies, you need scale. That just makes efficient sense. That's just logical economics. It has nothing to do with power plays, manipulation, or gouging, or any sort of thing like that. It's a natural evolution of the system. The United States food system has evolved over the last 100 years to be the most efficient in the world. And that is because of evolutions in technology like that. And bargaining between large organizations is just part of it.
I would push back on this efficiency, though. What is efficient when a lot of the negative externalities are not put into the price? If it's efficient, take Iowa. Iowa is known as agriculture. Americans view Iowa as like LA is to Hollywood for agriculture. It's basically an extraction colony at this point. 60 to 70% of the waterways in Iowa are too polluted for people to go in. It's the second highest cancer rate in the country. Most of that land's actually being wasted because we're burning in our cars for no reason, for no actual gains. But then even for like efficiency between companies, like there's not, at some point when the third largest company is buying the fourth largest, there's only so much HR staff you can fire. It's really about, you want to basically consolidate markets so you can increase prices. At the same time, too, the dark undercurrent of the food system is you're seeing a lot of the dark stuff of the past return. Notably, the chickenization of everything, the offshoring of a lot of the produce in the American system, which usually means the use of child labor and really exploitative labor practices. That's like the dirty secret of any produce that moves to Mexico is you have the rise of modern day plantations. If these, that's like the really dark undercurrent to keep in mind here is what are these efficiencies really? Is it the exploitation of labor, the exploitation of the land that are not being put into these prices?
Yeah, perhaps we can dive deeper on that actually. And because in the antitrust world, we talk a lot about efficiencies with any proposed merger or combination. In the food space here, Tim, why don't I pose this to you? What are some of the efficiencies that we might see that could be benefits realized from transactions in this space?
I want to back up to Austin's first point about exploitation of rivers in Iowa. The point here is big business and concentration and things like that. I no doubt that there is externalities involved in agricultural production in the Midwest of the U.S., but those are farmers. Farmers are using the water in the Midwest. Those are small. They're not as small as they were 100 years ago, but those are mostly small farmers. There's thousands of them in the Midwest that draw water out of the Ogallala and things like that, and use phosphates and nitrogen fertilizers that finds its way back into the river system. Competitive firms don't internalize externalities. So you're conflating two arguments there between big companies and exploitation of resources. No one doubts that there are sustainability issues in production agriculture, and we're working to solve that. But you don't confuse the two issues.
I mean, what is a farmer? My hog baron does 5 million hogs, employs 7,000 people.
How many of those?
The hog family farm is dead. The dairy family farm is dead. The cattle rancher family farm is essentially dying in front of us. Most farmland in Iowa is owned by non-Iowans now. They're capital assets. I would be very careful. I mean, are we talking LLCs, S corps? Like, let's not use language that's not really.
How many hog farms are there in the U.S.? How many dairy farms? How many beef farms?
10 corporate entities control 70% of the hog supply. Are you a farmer if you don't own your animal? I mean, that's like a good question to even ask here.
Sure, there's large farmers. They've grown up over time, but there still is thousands of them. You can't use an example, an anecdotal evidence of one or two small large farmers. I mean, and generalize.
When you do 5 million hogs, that's what the market is. That's what the hog industry is. It's not an anecdotal example. The notion of piggies on a land or dairy cows on a land, that's dead. That is like, I saw that when I was a kid, but that is not what these industries are.
But your exploitation of water gets to crop farmers. How many crop farmers are there?
So let's back up. First of all, I mean, most of that is
in the U.S. Do you know the numbers? There's hundreds of thousands of them.
Google. That's a competitive it's called industry. Google, Tim. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head.
I want to interject here for a second and go back to the question Evan posed. And what I thought was interesting about the question Evan posed about potential efficiencies to be gained from consolidation is that I think we, as a group, we can agree that there has been consolidation, at least at the processor level and also at the retail grocery level. The way Evan phrased the question was, what might be some of the gains? And this is my question. This is my follow-up question to Austin and Tim, was that it is understood in antitrust that when you come forward with a merger, you talk about these potential gains that you see. But do either of you, either at the processor level or the retail grocery level, when you see some of these mergers, does it actually result in lower prices for the consumer or higher wages for workers? Or does that profit or rent, depending on how you look at it, just get absorbed by the corporate entity?
All right, I'll start with that one. To respond to Evan's original question, there's lots of sources of scale economies. Just focus on the retail industry because it's hard to sweep both processors, manufacturers, packers, however you wanted to describe them. So just talk about retail. Retail food is a highly scale-intensive business. Technology, distribution, wholesaling, all of that requires scale to reduce costs. If you have fixed costs, the lower your costs are going to be, the more units you can spread it across. So that's just basic economics 101 for why costs tend to be lower for larger businesses. Now, your second question, Anant, as to whether prices actually fall following mergers. The seminal paper in this area done by some people at the FTC actually in 2018 showed that mergers result in higher prices only when there's existing concentration greater than the existing, the 2010 horizontal merger guideline level of 2,500 for HHIs. Anything below that, they were pro-competitive. So you can't just say the mergers result in higher prices across the board.
I mean, I think of this like Goldilocks. There is a certain sweet spot here in scale. But then I think the meat market's a really good example when this just goes too far. And when you see concentrations of economic power corrupt the local system. I mean, JBS is my slaughtering baron in my book. I don't think it's outlandish to say they're the closest thing we have to a criminal organization in American, in corporate America, when they pled guilty to bribing their way to monopoly level status. And by the way, we let them keep their monopoly. We still funnel USDA dollars to them. And so, I mean, this company is known to be accused of using child labor rampantly, bribing meat inspectors, besides bribing politicians. Is there some, when they buy a new meat brand, like which they did, by the way, I mean, that's like my personal frustration these last 4 years is I think one of the most bipartisan things now in America is actually to reform the meat markets. We've done this before. And the fact is these markets have gotten more concentrated, including JBS making an acquisition this past year. To the same point now, it's really scary and fascinating is Walmart's making these aggressive plays into the food industry because it's sick of being basically gouged by these companies. Because most consumers, you judge your grocery store based on the meat and dairy case. And you have, massive consolidation in the dairy side with like DFA and all those milk cooperatives. And then on the meat side, you have JBS and the likes, which, by the way, they're state-backed monopolies. And that's a whole different conversation because you're not even competing on a level playing field. But on top of that, so Walmart's being gouged. So Walmart's didn't like that. So Walmart's making aggressive plays now into beef and into the dairy industry. So we shouldn't depend on Walmart to save us, but that's kind of where we are.
Just to stay with that for a second, because you mentioned Walmart, you're talking about Walmart here, and throughout your book, you obviously focus on a whole chapter related to Walmart, and there was a part of it which mentioned that through the 90s, Walmart was able to capitalize on certain efficiencies, which allowed it to have lower prices. So, was that an example of consolidation helping to increase efficiencies, or is there something that we need to be concerned about with what occurred during that process?
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. I mean, that's my favorite chapter in my book. It's twice the length of any other chapter. I find grocery stores fascinating. Sam Walton, to me, is you have to respect him, what he built. But Sam Walton couldn't do what Sam Walton did because of Sam Walton to today. That whole regulatory system that allowed him to emerge and build an incredible business has been essentially been gutted. He did a lot of innovations, like you said, using barcodes, all that kind of stuff. But it's a classic story of as you get large. I mean, let me back up. They only entered the grocery space because he saw a Carrefour. It's like a European company on vacation, something called a hypermarket US. So he copied that concept, create the supercenter. You don't really make money on groceries. He wanted you to come in the store, so then you would buy tennis balls where you'd make money. Large market power, but they exploit that. I mean, they exploit the leverage they have now in the food system because they're so dominant. I mean, my best little example of Walmart's dominance of how they showcase it is they have a rule with suppliers that no more than 30% of your sales can come from Walmart. And I didn't understand that. I actually had to ask Errol, that former Whole Foods person, why they do it. And he goes, Austin, that's a supply chain risk management thing. Walmart knows it's such a vulture. It needs you to get 70% of your business elsewhere because you basically sell to Walmart at cost because it does all those different shenanigans to essentially lock in the lowest price possible at Walmart that you can't offer. So you essentially make your profit elsewhere. So Walmart wants you in purgatory, but doesn't want to kill you.
Yeah, Walmart is an excellent example of efficiencies in the U.S. food system. I do a lot of work in the fresh produce industry, and it's common knowledge that Walmart prices are 10 to 15% lower to the grower than they are on the spot markets. And fresh produce is a really interesting example because there still are active spot markets throughout the U.S. For fresh produce of any type that you want to name. Growers fight over themselves to get those 10 to 15% lower price contracts because they're continuous, they're reliable. They love dealing with Walmart because it's a professional organization. They know that they want high quality, and the very best growers are able to supply to Walmart. Wringing inefficiencies out of the system is not a crime, and that's what Walmart does. Again, I don't know if there's any empirical evidence in your book at all because I'm not going to read it, but all the academic research points to the fact that when Walmart moves into a market, the other companies, the retail stores that fail, are the ones that look like Walmart, the big supermarkets. All the little ones, the small mom and pop stores survive. They thrive because Walmart creams off those price-sensitive consumers, and the rest of the Trader Joe's, Whole Foods market goes to where they want to go. So it's hard to sweep, make generalizations and sweep the whole industry under the carpet using Walmart as an example. Walmart has reduced prices for consumers over time. There's no arguing that.
So we've talked a lot about the different implications that consolidation can have and sort of other effects that happen as a result of changes in the food industry. But in terms of enforcement, what is the role of antitrust here? Is it something that antitrust enforcers should be looking at, or is this something that other agencies should be diving into as well?
I'll take that one. There definitely is a role for antitrust. Historically, I think the importance of the Sherman Antitrust Act and all the associated acts that form the suite of antitrust law, that I don't have to explain to this group, are important. The thing is, I think there's always sort of a bias toward overzealous enforcement. That it has to be fact-based. And the horizontal merger guidelines are important in that regard, in following their sort of trajectory over time, through the 2010 and 2023 rewrites, as to what is regarded as important when we evaluate mergers and acquisitions, and what are the thresholds that should incur sort of, antitrust scrutiny, I guess. And I think there's a growing and more sophisticated economics literature on that shows when prices are enhanced and when they are actually lower after mergers and things. And I think The most interesting thing about I'm sure we're going to get to it later, but the most recent case of Kroger-Albertson's merger is this the first time that labor's been evaluated, and made part of an actual FTC and DOJ discussion for antitrust. And I think that's really interesting. So we're not just holding consumer objectives important here. It's labor has assumed some sort of level of importance in antitrust. But again, I think we can be overzealous in our pursuit of antitrust goals just to break up for breaking up's sake. And I think holding consumer welfare in general paramount, I think, is important. We have to keep our eyes on the prize for what antitrust law can actually do.
I would just add two things. One, it's hard to say overzealous when there's really been no enforcement in the food space for most of my lifetime, especially when you, like, going back to my point earlier, when you have the largest meat company in America and in the world got there through bribery, and they're allowed to keep their their monopoly built through bribery. It's like really a big threat to like the business environment when you have someone you essentially legalize that behavior. That said, my big thing is I really want to increase data transparency. We don't know what's going on in a lot of these markets, but it's pretty easy to get that information. I mean, everything you buy at the store, that checkout data is sold by Wall Street firms. I got it from my book. Just want to know, I know Tim disregarded my book, but I have 1,000 citations, and I'm a former CRS person. That was my first job in DC. And to my knowledge, I only have one error in the book, and it's kind of a funny one. I identify this woman named Julie Dunn, fighting my hog baron, as being from El Dorado, Iowa, when she's really from Eldora. But data transparency is my big thing. Like, to that point I made earlier about that one company having 85% market share in milk in New England and the tri-state area. That's likely pretty common across America, because when we talk about meat and dairy and stuff, we talk about a national level, but that information is pretty useless for like the cattle rancher in Montana. Like, they're not going to take their cattle down to Georgia to get it butchered. So having more state level, regional data on market shares, all this kind of stuff would really help just enlighten these conversations and just show people. I mean, my favorite little example is actually there's a monopoly or peanut butter, dominant player. Schmuckers has like a 50-60% market share in peanut butter, but it's actually it's likely higher than that because they do the store brands, and you only find out when they do the store brands is when there's a peanut recall. So, I mean, that would be a really interesting thing to do, is just to help have these more enlightened conversations, is to have better data out there. And I mean, that's like the scary thing here is you saw under the Trump administration, the ERS be essentially gutted and moved to Kansas City. And part of that was intentional by the bidding of industry to kind of really undermine this kind of data stuff.
Actually, it's interesting you bring transparency up, because we had a meeting yesterday with the USDA Office of the Chief Economist, and the livestock market reporting feature of the Packers and Stockyards Act means that livestock prices, both boxed beef and exchange cattle, has to be made public. And that's part of the whole concept, right? Is sunshine is the best disinfectant. If farmers know what the prices of cattle are going to be at any given place, any given time, then they're able to make wise choices as to where to send them. So you can't say that there's lack of transparency in the beef market. All of those prices are known, and even contracted prices. There's several different types of contract, ways that farmers sell cattle to processors, and all of those prices are widely known. So you can't say that it's not transparent.
I mean, cattle market's the only real spot market left in the meat, and they're trying to kill it. I mean, they killed it in hogs. That's why the cattle ranchers are really pushing heavily. There's that bill to maintain the spot market, and Congress can't even pass that basic thing because the meat lobbies are going against it because they want to move to contracts. I mean, that is, from my gathering, is half the reason why JAB came into the coffee market was they want to essentially kill the spot market in the coffee industry. So I'd be careful with that. I mean, you talk to most ranchers, they're not big fans of USDA. I mean, I would be careful there.
Ranchers aren't a fan of any U.S. government agency.
So does Robinson-Patman play a role here? Robinson-Patman, for those of you who don't know, is an antitrust law that prevents sellers of commodities from charging different prices to buyers. It was used extensively to protect smaller grocers and retailers against larger Walmart-like operations. It fell into disuse with the Chicago School focus on pass-through efficiencies, but it's been dusted off, notably by FTC Commissioner Alvaro Bedoya. Could this play a role in reducing grocery prices?
We've actually done quite a bit of work on the Robinson-Patman Act empirical research. And we had detailed data on wholesale prices and retail prices, from several retailers. And what we found basically was the whole concept, and one of the original criticisms of the Robinson-Patman Act is that it protects competitors instead of protecting competition. So that's exactly what banning wholesale price competition or wholesale price discrimination does. And in this paper, what we saw was it actually counterproductive. That it protected the most important, most powerful sellers in the market, and it left the least powerful ones, ones that consumers had least preferences for, left them by the wayside. So those are very general sort of conceptual arguments, and we actually have empirical evidence that that's true.
Let's be careful with the term empirical evidence here. I mean, numbers can say anything you want, so let's just be very, very careful by using words like that. I rather use like well-reported Wall Street Journal article stories. And there was actually a really good one on a story on Pine Ridge grocery store that really, but do you not agree with that? I mean, it's hard for me to take a lot of this academic literature serious when they're not let me back up. I think an underappreciated thing in this space is how much checkoff money
unless you have data, unless you have empirical evidence, unless you do econometrics, how are you going to draw generalizations? Your little stories are meaningless, right?
They're not stories. I mean, I think common sense says we're paying more for garbage. Go abroad, go to a European country, you have better food.
And that's the whole idea behind antitrust, right?
So economists taking money from industry are right, but somehow reporters at the Wall Street Journal are wrong. Okay, I got you.
Right.
I think the corporate capture of some of these land grants is really concerning to me. I think it's concerning to most Americans, especially in the food space. Checkoff money has been underappreciated. Let's take the hog checkoff. Unbeknownst to most Americans, farmers have to pay a tax into a program to advertise their good called checkoffs. So pork, the other white meat, got milk, all that. But because of vertical integration of these spaces, hog's a good example of that. These promotional groups essentially do the bidding of industry. So like Smithfield, the largest hog packer in America, Chinese owned by the way, also owns 1 in 5 hogs. So the voice of the hog farmers is really the voice of checkoff. What they realize is these advertising campaigns don't work. So essentially now they use it to finance junk science. So a lot of the scientific studies you see coming out are financed by academics doing this type of work. A lot of these, you get tenure in these universities by how much money you bring in. This is not being disclosed, especially since we privatize our land grants. So like that, and I also say this as an Iowan. To me, Iowa's canary in the coal mine for the American food system. Iowa should be the Italy of North America, but now it's basically West Virginia in the 19th century. And we should really look to what happened there and why is this state not able to grapple with it? And it's because you have these concentrated cartels essentially capturing the political system, really enable, like the water quality is getting worse in Iowa. Like it's just it has a cancer crisis. I mean, it has an obesity crisis. I think that says everything. You don't need some econometric study to tell you that there's a corporate capture going on and an exploitation of things. And we should also not be shocked that a strong man's filling this void. And that we're dancing around a really dark point in our country right now.
If you're casting dispersions on my profession because we do things that industry is interested in, how are you not telling stories to sell books? How do you not have a financial interest in coming up with these fake conspiracy theories to sell your book? How is it not
Tim,
exactly
here's a dirty secret. No one makes money in books. Books are highly consolidated. Look at my publisher. I was published by a nonprofit publisher. You don't make money in books.
Turning to the Kroger-Albertson merger that we talked about earlier, it's perhaps one of the most prominent enforcement actions in the food industry now. Kroger and Albertson are supermarket companies that together operate almost 5,000 supermarkets across the country. In October 2022, Kroger announced it proposed a $24.6 billion acquisition of Albertson, which is the largest proposed supermarket merger in U.S. history. In late February of this year, the FTC sued to block the merger. The FTC will have its preliminary injunction hearing in Portland, Oregon on August 26th, which is essentially like a trial that is expected to last for 2 to 3 weeks. Why do you guys think that the FTC is challenging this merger?
From my perspective, in a lot of local markets, Kroger and Albertsons were two of the major players. Just to use Phoenix as an example, the HHI, I think your audience understands what that is without explanation, would have taken it from 1,800 before the merger to 4,300 after. So, as sympathetic as I am to mergers on efficiency purposes, I think that does go over any threshold that you could consider reasonable for antitrust scrutiny. That's a huge gain. And I know we'll talk about the CNS deal and things like that, but in a lot of local markets, particularly California, Arizona, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, it's going to go way over the threshold that the FTC has set under both the 2010 and the 2023 merger guidelines.
Yeah, I have nothing much. The only thing I would add on to that is I think to me is the most fascinating pending merger right now, and I really think it comes down to the election. To be blunt, I think you would have another Sprint T-Mobile on your hands here.
So, in addition to the traditional harms to consumers that are alleged in the FTC's complaint, they also allege potential harm in the labor market. Kroger and Albertsons are two of the largest employers of union labor in the grocery space, and the FTC views them as competitors in the labor market. How do you, Tim, Austin, what do you make of this labor claim? And is the labor claim potentially at odds with a focus on end price to consumers that we see in other parts of the FTC's complaints?
I think there's two parts to that question, Anant. It's a really good one. There's direct effects and indirect effects. The direct effect, right, is that if wages change, the cost to grocers change, and that's going to impact the prices that they pay to consumers. But I think the really interesting thing about this part is an explicit concern not for the consumer impact, but for the labor market impact, the fact that worker outcomes are important to antitrust law. And I think that's pretty clear in all of the statements that the FTC has made about the merger. We used that to motivate a paper we did a couple of years ago and just finished about 3 months ago, where we looked at there's a big literature in economics that looks at the impact of concentration, industrial concentration in several different industries, and lots of times across industries on wage outcomes. And the general finding is that there is a negative correlation, meaning HHI goes up, wages go down. But most of that evidence is from very specific industries, teachers, nurses, things like that. So we replicated some of these studies using exactly the same approach and exactly the same data. And we found that in simple models of just looking at HHI wages, there was no impact. Because the general explanation there is that retail labor is fungible, as opposed to nurses who are kind of locked into the two big hospitals, say in a town or something like that. If you're a cashier, if you're a stock person at a Walmart, at a Target, et cetera, you can work in virtually any other job in the retail industry. But that said, we then looked at a more specific model in which we looked at firm by firm negotiating outcomes. It's a structural econometric model, so it's complicated. But the thing is that if we look at how workers and employers allocate surplus, every transaction, there is a margin. Even if it's perfectly competitive industries, there's a margin of price over cost, over marginal cost of selling goods, that pays for labor and pays for all those other things. What we showed is that negotiated equilibrium, that in higher HHI industries or markets, meaning that more concentrated markets, employers actually did have more bargaining power. So that is a significant effect. And the difference there is that one's a market outcome and the other gets to these individual negotiating dyads between employers and employees. So once you get under the hood and really, crank through the data, there is a negative effect between HHI and worker outcomes. So I think that's an important thing that needs to be elevated in this discussion.
And Tim, this reminds me of some of the scholarship by David Autor on labor markets. And you talk about the dyads, the individual negotiating power. And if I recall correctly, he said that if anything, we overestimate how much negotiating power any worker has individually because of various stickiness and behavioral economics that result in people just being unwilling to switch jobs.
Right. Yeah, his insights power what I do. His Superstars paper that he had a couple years ago is really important, right? Because in the retail grocery space, basically the intuition behind his Superstars paper is that we can't assume that companies that have a large share of the market are doing so because of market power, because of dominance issues and untoward objectives and things like that. They just simply do things better and they pay better. In the retail food space, Costco is a great example of that. They have a large market share in many markets. They do great. The customer, service evaluations are great. They also pay their workers higher than anybody else. So that's an example of a superstar firm in the grocery space that is an example of what David Autor is talking about. And it's powered by paying employees well and not exploiting them.
But just, using a grocery example, on the flip side, you have Walmart, where, classic story of once you have economic power, you lock in your dominance through corrupting the political system to the point now where, the dark side too of the Walmart is most of their employees live on some kind of government assistance. So I'd be careful with that's like Louis Brandeis' famous thing he always feared is the corruption of the political system through economic dominance. Because, it makes sense from a business standpoint. Why not? You don't want to compete. You want to lock in your dominance. I would just add on to the Kroger-Albertson thing, two things. It's a good example of the big boys like to run with big boys thing. They're just responding to a concentrated space. And with a dominant player like Walmart, they're trying to essentially get more market power to go up against their suppliers and also their competitors. And I think the thing to keep in mind, though, with these two companies for most consumers is they don't realize what's going on because there's so many brands both companies own. There's that illusion of choice. So, we might know that, Kroger owns 20-some brands. We could, maybe people in this industry can name the 20, but the average American sees, look at all these different brands. I have a competitive market. Kind of going back to my peanut butter example, Smucker's owns a bunch of different brands, a bunch of different price points. But, that's why I think, unbeknownst to most people, is they don't realize that concentration.
Yeah, actually, Walmart, just go back to the labor example. Walmart's a great example of that. Earlier this spring, they announced that, a new compensation program for managers that they can make up to $500,000 a year. And most of these managers move up through the industry. We have a program at ASU where we train grocery managers just because we realized that fact 10 years ago, that most managers don't have degrees. They just come up through the retail, learn the ropes as stock people, back of the store, maybe cashiers, and then they eventually grow into a management role. Walmart realized that their turnover was too high among these people and that their store performance was directly related to the quality and the incentives that managers face. So that's why they have a lot of these, performance participation programs where they can make up to $500,000 each.
It's also why a congressional study 10 years ago estimated the average Walmart employee gets about $5,000 in government welfare because they're not paid enough to make a decent living. And that was 10 years ago. So who knows? I know I know what you're talking about. It was a really good PR stunt they did. Of hey, look at this Walmart manager can make up to, but the reality is most Walmart workers are not making a living wage.
So Kroger and Albertsons came back with a fix. They have pledged to invest $500 million to cut prices, $1 billion to raise worker wages and benefits, and $1.3 billion to improve Albertson stores. They also agreed to divest at least 579 stores to Piggly Wiggly chain owner C&S Wholesale Grocers. And they make the argument that this merger is necessary for them to compete with larger companies like Amazon and Walmart. Tim, Austin, what do you make of their counter arguments?
Let's focus on the CNS deal. I think that's it's interesting to look at in terms of its detail because unlike the last time that acquisitions or antitrust issues in the grocery industry were avoided by spinning off, some stores to an undercapitalized purchaser, which failed. I think that historical context is important, right? Because in this time, they made sure that they had a partner that was well capitalized, that was, a credible purchaser. Let's put it that way. CNS is not just an owner of Piggly Wiggly. CNS has like 7,500 retail customers for their wholesale business. And most of the economics in retailing comes from the wholesale side. It's the supply chain stuff. It's the sophistication of dealing with the big processors, manufacturers, organizing, the spot markets from growers of fresh produce that don't have big, sophisticated sellers. So that wholesaling bit is incredibly important to the retailing industry. So having CNS as a purchaser is legit from that perspective, right? This is not just a fly-by-night company. CNS is a legit partner. That said, just the geographic distribution of the stores, I'm a little bit leery as to whether that's actually going to work, right? As to whether these stores are going to be viable competitors. Because the grocery industry, although the main owners now tend to have national presence, grocery markets are all local, right? Every time we do analysis of grocery markets, we look at competitive spaces on the order of 3 miles in diameter around each individual store. So grocery markets are incredibly local. So unless you have that expertise and that distribution that can reach all of those local markets, I don't know how it's going to work. I'm skeptical on that one.
I agree with Tim.
We've been talking throughout the podcast about the role of antitrust and the bottom line of prices at the grocery store. What do you see as the impact that this potential merger would have to prices at grocery stores should it be allowed to go through?
From my own perspective, I would hope that the FTC and the DOJ have done their due diligence, as I mentioned before. I'm a data guy, so I'm assuming that they're going to crank through the numbers and they're going to find direct evidence and not just rely on this sort of structural presumption that, high concentration leads to bad outcomes. We need to do this market by market. We need to crunch the numbers. We need to forecast what the implications are going to be. That said, as I mentioned before, because this merger does go over those thresholds which we have established in the past that have some empirical validity, I don't think this should go through.
I really think if a Democrat wins, this won't go through, and if a Republican wins in November, it'll go through. I think that's where we are right now.
So what are the key takeaways here for practitioners?
Well, I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens as all the Kroger-Albertson stuff plays out, both in terms of the actual substance of the merger, but also just in terms of the administration and how they take whatever happens there and pivot either to continue to pursue things like that or to perhaps use a more whole of government approach and bring in other agencies to try to add regulation or enforcement mechanisms into the food and agriculture industries. Austin, why don't I toss it to you? What's a key takeaway in your mind?
Yeah, I think to me, it's what my big key takeaway is there's a lot of paper potentials here of like what the system should be. I think it's pretty universally accepted that the system's currently not working for most Americans. And I think there truly is a bipartisan consensus there to reform the markets, especially the meat industry. What do you do? What do you do with a company when they have an 85% market share in the milk industry in the East Coast? What do you do about JBS? What do you do when the company bribes their way to monopoly level status? It's easy to focus on the bad, but focus on what the system could be and what you do with these problems. That's kind of what I tend to gravitate towards right now. I think people crave it. They crave a positive vision. And honestly, my biggest hope in the food system right now is the Biden administration has been really aggressive at transitioning the American auto fleet to hybrids and EVs, which means the coming death of ethanol likely. And that's the single largest use of corn. So what are you going to do with, what are you going to do with all that land that's no longer going to be needed in the Midwest? My big thing is put animals back on it, but what does that regulatory system look like?
And from my perspective, my whole take on this, my whole career has been that simple solutions are most often wrong. To point fingers, it's a fallacy of visibility, right? To point fingers at big business as the culprits in all this is an easy target, right? Because they make the headlines every day because they're big. We don't talk about the good work that the millions of small farmers across the world are doing every day, and the thousands of them in the U.S. And we need to be, when we look for policy solutions to issues that we see, they need to be fact-based. They need to be based in data. They need to be based in empirical evidence. They can't be based on conjectures and theories.
And finally, Erika.
Keep your eye on the Robinson Patent Act. Although since the 70s, it hasn't really been used as a tool for antitrust enforcement, it could be more frequently wielded as a means to limit retailer power.
Well, thank you, Evan, Erika, Austin, and Tim, for a robust discussion on a question that American families wrestle with every week, which is, why is my grocery bill so high? To our listeners, be sure to subscribe on your podcast platform of choice, and we'll see you next time on Trust and Trade.